Hey students, welcome to my living room today. Darius is my son's girlfriend is visiting, so my study has been taken over. Um, I'm greeting you from a different part of the house. Sorry about the wobbling that's happening right now. So today we're really beginning to explore creative nonfiction, not just sort of in general terms, but specifically in terms of its structure. Creative nonfiction as a genre is pretty misunderstood, actually, and sometimes not very well respected by writers in other genres, especially fiction writers. Part of this is that that fiction writers often misunderstand what creative nonfiction is actually doing and what it's about. One of the bases for this misunderstanding is based in a actually real element of creative nonfiction, which is creative nonfiction is a true story, well told, using all of the creative devices of fiction. And a lot of that is covered in the Dinty Moore video that you watched on Tuesday, or we're supposed to watch for Tuesday. And Dinty does a great job of making that humorous. And Dinty's and that's some of the more important basic elements of creative nonfiction. Is the ethos of it is very important. That is, you're trying to get at the truth the best you can, recognizing that the truth is difficult to access because it's not just about telling the truth, it's about getting at the truth. And we all recognize how difficult that can be, that the truth is a complicated, multi-layered thing. And how do you tell someone else the truth when we're so adept at lying to ourselves, when memory fails us so readily and so easily? So creative nonfiction is a challenge just ethically in trying to get something down on the page that's true. There's also the challenge of telling truth about others. Creative nonfiction writers are faced with a real ethical dilemma about the fact that they're writing about other people who don't get a chance within the context of your essay to reply to your representation of them. And it's unusual, but nonfiction writers have been sued by people written about in essays. In my case, I wasn't sued, but I had some very bad family arguments after the publication of my first book of creative nonfiction, Resisting Elegy. And because I was so determined to be honest and fair, actually, but even if you're telling the truth about someone, the question is, do you really have the right to expose that moment of their life to the world? These are all real issues and issues that that are worth considering and being concerned about, with the recognition that the truth really is a primary value in creative nonfiction. You can't and shouldn't just make it up. There are some things you can do. You can actually make some progress in terms of speculating, and you can develop a scene and add details that maybe you don't necessarily remember. But you really want to try to avoid having somebody do something they never did or say something they've never said. And you still have to consider how much you have a right to expose their lives and their past. These are real issues. I won't hide them from you. They are bound up in some, the reason I'm talking about all of that, which are the ethical issues of creative nonfiction, is that they do lead to some of the interesting and compelling complexities of the genre. The genre is simply not a true story told the way stories are told, with an exposition, rising action, climax, and falling action, as I cover in the essay that I had you read for Tuesday. Nonfiction is doing more than that. It's not only telling you a story, it's exploring the value of that story. It's making an argument for why it matters in all the ways that it could matter. So it explores, it examines, and explains the subject. It doesn't just tell the story. So if you're telling a story about, in fiction, if you were to tell a story about someone who has a fight with somebody and then drinks and then gets in a car and is an accident, you're telling the story of that. And there may be ironies and levels in symbolism that reveals levels of meaning. But in an essay, the speaker of that story, which could be the mother of the victim, or it could be the person himself who was in the accident, um, is examining, why did I do this? What led me to this event? What are the consequences? What kind of burden do I bear? Can anybody get past this? What are the levels of responsibility? What are the levels of grief? What are all of the levels of humanity that this moment in my life explores and exposes? Nonfiction, as a result, tends to be fairly raw. That great video you watched, where there's smoke, is a great example of a nonfiction essay, because throughout the story that she's telling, she's giving commentary about what she thought then and what she thinks now. The voice of innocence, the person who experienced it, and also how she's processing it when she's looking back at it. We'll talk more about that voice of innocence and voice and experience in my next video, which is on that subject. But these are some of the inherent elements of creative nonfiction that make it compelling and make it interesting. There's no such thing as just a straight factual telling of a story in creative nonfiction. There is always a level and a layer of commentary happening, where the author is examining his or her experience for why it matters and what it tells them about the world and tells them about themselves. In some ways, you could say that creative nonfiction is always an exploration of identity. That is, the identity of the person writing the story. Even if it's about someone else, it's about you. Every photograph is really taking a picture of the person holding the camera, especially in creative nonfiction. All right, so what are some of the very basic things I want you to know from this video? Well, the most fundamental thing is this idea of scene and commentary. So I'm going to go back to that essay I had you read a couple days ago, and I'm going to share screen it here if I can figure out how to do that. And I think I should be able to fairly successfully. There we are. So right now you should be seeing the page on in backwards and forwards. I think it's page 11, where I begin to talk about the structure of creative nonfiction. And the most important thing I want you to get out of this is this idea of scene, commentary, and scene. I talked in the last class about how essential imagery is. You can't write without being able to construct or craft an image. In creative nonfiction, that's what happens within a scene. It's the exploration, the evocation of the moment in all of its elements. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. And usually that is told through the voice of innocence, even if you're talking about an experience from your personal past. And I want to pause here to say, I did have a couple of people saying, my past is very painful and I don't know if I want to write about it. You can write about your present as well, but you do need to write about something. And in fact, it's almost impossible to write about the present, because I'd be writing about, if I were right now, I was creating a video for instruction on the structure of creative nonfiction. I mean, even as I'm writing it, it becomes the past. So you're always writing about your past. There's no way to write any present in nonfiction is a false present. You're pretending and you're using that moment as the present, but it's not in effect actually happening right now. But even when you're talking about the past, the scenic elements, that moment where you're just describing this happened, and then the next thing happened, and the next thing happened, or you're describing a scene, you're describing someone's facial features, this is the scene. And if you think about this in filmic terms, the scene is all of the scene, or mise-en-scene, are all of the visual elements within a particular shot that help to create the environment and the tone of that particular scenic moment. So usually a scene has a narrative structure roughly. It is a beginning, middle, and an end. And it's basically telling you what happened. What follows that in creative nonfiction is an exploration of why that moment mattered and what it means. The exploration, the examination, and the explanation. All right. In the place of a sustained narrative, the essayist makes the use of scenes anecdotes, not antidotes, anecdotes. My students sometimes use antidotes. And characterizations and ideas that are themselves investigated in service of to the original question that you're asking. And this goes to the idea that every essay is essentially asking a question about what it means to be human. A particular question: what does it mean to grieve? What does it mean to live? What does it mean to love? What does it mean to have an addiction? And these scenes contribute to the controlling idea that's underlying your piece. So you'll start with a place, it'll travel out into commentary and then come back to it. While there isn't any geometric shape like there is for fiction, where you've got that nice triangle that defines creative nonfiction, you might think of it looking roughly like what I have here, which is the occasion, which is the reason you're writing the essay. Now, the occasion in creative nonfiction could be anything. If I'm walking into a parking lot and I see a couple fighting and there's a child in the car, that they're fighting outside the car and the child's in the car watching them. This actually happened to me. That can be used as the occasion for writing about something else, because obviously I'm not going to poke my head in the car, get in and talk to the kid, or hang around and talk to these people and try to counsel them through their marriage crisis, assuming they're even married, because I don't know. So what do you do with that scene? I mean, if you do, it's an important moment. You know it's important because you can't, like, you walk into the store, you're still thinking about it. You go home and you talk to your partner, your parents, and you're still thinking about it. And so you have that scene, but that scene goes nowhere unless it connects you to something else. So that's what we call an occasion. It's the thing that got you going on your topic, that got you thinking about it. So that could be about any number of things. It could lead you back to a moment that you remember as a child when you were in the backseat of the car and your parents were fighting. It could lead you to think about an argument that you're involved in with your current partner. It could lead you to concerns and issues about, depending on the situation and who you're looking at, gender, sexuality, race, just about anything that's important to you that you're contemplating in that moment as you watch that, or parenting, as you watch that argument. And that is what the essay is going to be about. It's not really about what started the essay. It's about what that moment caused you to start thinking about and wanting to explore. So that's the occasion, which in this case was itself a scene. Then the thinking about it, which is the commentary. Usually that's voice of experience butting its nose in. Then it goes back to, it could be a completely different scene, like I just said before. So a scene in which you remember a fight your parents had, or a fight that you had, and actually get a fight your parents had, and then jump 20 years later to a fight that you were in. Or it could be completely something different. And then it could lead to maybe dialogue with another character, and then commentary, which is the voice of innocence, again, exploring the moment. Essays don't have a designated length, which is incredibly frustrating. I put word counts on things not just to give you targets. And I try to keep repeating this to students. I really don't care if you make or go past word counts so much. But if you don't, I don't give students a word as a ballpark figure about what they should be doing. They tend to get frantic and have anxiety. So I give you word counts. If you write past a word count, I'm not going to stop reading as long as it's, worth reading. If you don't make the word count, I might just tell you how you might develop it. I wouldn't worry about it too much. How long should an essay be? About as long as a piece of string, which is as long as it needs to be to answer the question that you were asking through writing this essay, usually about why this moment or this thing mattered to you. And you should feel free to improvise around the essay. The nature of an essay is digressive. In fact, the tendency to wander off topic is one of the signature elements of essay writing. The controlling idea that maintains the essay's coherency, the question that the author is implicitly trying to answer, allows for a great deal of elasticity and movement. They explore, examine, and explain highly abstract questions, ideas, and issues. Um, and that means you have to let your associative impulses um, really have some free reign. But if you think about it, it's really not too hard to do. That moment I just talked about, even as I talked about it, probably some of you were listening to it and making associations, projecting yourself into that moment, thinking, what would I have done if I saw that? Or thinking about, oh yeah, I went through the same thing, or I remember being the kid in the back of that car. In that sense, my talking about it becomes the occasion for your thinking and starts the associative movements of your mind at work. An essay's structure, in that sense, maps the mind moving on the page. In other words, it actually mimics the way we think and the way we process experience as we see and as we feel and as we touch. It's interesting because the next thing I talk about in this essay is reading to write. But if you look at, and I'm going to give you just a couple more examples of some things that to show you this happening in real time. So right now, I'm hoping that you're looking at Eyes Like Lithium. And I wanted to take a look, and you'll notice that I deliberately gave you a copy that has all of my notes on them. Sometimes my notes can be a little profane and they're non-grammatical, and I don't care about any of that. These are my notes, but I'm sharing them with you to show you how a writer reads, how we process what we're looking for, how we see technique and process it. And this is really how a writer annotates text. And the questions that they ask as they go through it. I wanted to take a look at a couple of things that are going on here. First of all, so I'm going to go move ahead of the story and then I'm going to go back a little bit. So one of the things that Danielle Dana-Doolin is extremely good at is writing scenes, and she actually announces the scene to you. So whenever I ask students in class about this essay to talk about a scene they remember, they talk about this moment, and then I'm like, well, why did you remember that particular moment? Well, one, it's very well constructed. The other is she says it's a famous scene, so that gets stuck in your head. It's the famous scene with two men in a yard, fists clenched like fleshy bouquets. My father said, "You're going to fight me, rich boy? Think for a minute. How many fights have you been in? How many fights do you think I've been in?" My father had tanned arms and shoulders, tense beneath a swath of dirt. Jamie sunk into silence, turned away. That's it. That's amazing, isn't it? Like, it's a very short moment. Now, I'll also say there's no way the author remembers any of that. Why? She was too little. There's simply no way she would remember. So this is all secondhand. So the image of the fleshy bouquets, that's just something she's created. So that's the speculation and the kind of creativity you can get away with in nonfiction, so that you have a scene to construct. She's not using a photograph. She's using a combination of what she knows of her father, what her mother's told her from the scene, and her own ability to sort of imagine her way into the moment. All of this is just fine. So that's a scene, okay? Now, that is not really commentary. It's not really doing the work of commentary. I'm going to move back a little bit to show how she moves from a kind of a scene into commentary. So we have the scene of birth, when my mother finally contracted Micah from her body, which is such an interesting line in of itself. That's almost implicit commentary. I don't think anybody in the history of pregnancy has ever said about their child, well, how was your birth? Well, once I contracted Melissa from my body, it's the wrong kind of tone to set, but it also sets up how the family's complicated feelings about this child. They didn't give birth to him. She contracted him from her body. He didn't make a sound. My father wrapped him in blankets and laid him on a bed between them. Micah didn't cry until she touched him. Now, this is important because it's the first sign that there might be something wrong with the child, but something not neurotypical about this child. And this is where she moves into a discussion of autism. So you see this Okay, so here's the moment that she remembers. It's very visual. That's a scene. And then we move into commentary. Autism is marked by abnormal introversion and egocentricity. Autistic people have an atypical sense of in response to fear. My brother is terrified if you approach him unannounced, but might walk into interstate traffic. It is not a personality disorder. It is a developmental disorder with a spectrum of symptoms so varied as to be almost individualistic. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. If autism could create photographs, each one would be overexposed. It's this really interesting movement here, as I say in the comment here, moving back and forth between information, experience, information, metaphor. All of this is a really good exploration of creative nonfiction movement. And it's all happening sort of in real time. But she's done this movement from seeing to thinking about to like the thought process that this is very voice of experience, almost scholarly here, and then moving back into seeing. With my mother was pregnant when she met my father. So this is so there is this the important thing to remember here is however you structure it, there are scenes followed which are told in the voice of innocence, followed by commentary, which is voice of experience. And again, I'm going to do another shorter video on that in a couple of days, so you'll get to think a little bit more about the difference between voice of innocence and voice of experience. Some other things that I would note about the structure of creative nonfiction is that you'll notice it's nonlinear. She bounces all over the place in time here. And that's largely because creative nonfiction really isn't about the story. It's about the ideas that the story helps us to explore. This essay by Danielle Cadena-Doolin is about her brother, but it doesn't tell one story. It's trying to explore her relationship with her brother and ask a number of questions like, what does it mean to have a brother who has autism? What are our responsibilities to each other? Which is, a lot of this is guilt, is driven by guilt. She's exploring her guilt for not protecting her brother. At one poignant moment in this essay, she apologized to her brother, and he says, "Why are you apologizing? You didn't do anything." And of course, that's what she's apologizing for, is for not doing anything. He sees her as heroic, as the wonderful scene of her stepping in the doorway, and she's surrounded by the light. But the way we see a moment is conditioned by what we're looking for. And if you think about that, if you think of someone walking, anybody who's ever been in bed and it's dark and someone opens a door and you see that person come into the light, that square of the door, what do you actually see? Well, you see a silhouette. Now, Micah could have described that as a very dark moment. You were, I saw you in the doorway. You were the absence of light. Actually, that would be a totally legitimate and visually accurate way of talking about her. But he says, no, you were standing in the light. You were surrounded by the light, which is a very different feeling. And it shows you how he views his sister. Now, from her own point of view, I'm not sure that's how she felt about herself. In her own point of view, she might have been the darkness. And that's what she's struggling with. To what extent is she responsible for her father's abuse of her brother? And she carries that, and this essay is exploring that beautifully and evocatively through imagery and through commentary and through asking very difficult and very tough questions about her personal experience. Okay, I hope this was helpful to you. I wish I could go through every sentence of that incredible essay by Danielle Cadena-Doolin, but I'll hold it up to you. It's a very short essay, really, so do read it. If you want like a primer on how to write creative nonfiction, you could do worse than just copying the moves that Danielle Cadena-Doolin makes. Hope this was helpful to you. I wish I could have a conversation with you about this. But that is coming as I start to get more and more of your work. At this point, you should have turned in your first class journal and your reading response, which the links for which are on Creative Nonfiction. Some of you have already asked about You've asked some questions about, well, I tried to get it in, but I had a problem with the, for the first couple of weeks, I'm going to be pretty forgiving about, your technology issues and things like that. It's really hard to do these videos without like fixing your hair and like worrying about how you look, isn't it? But do try to get on top of these things, get into the habit of doing them. There is a rhythm to the schedule. I will be posting the times for our Zoom meetings very soon, and the groups, or who's in what group. If you have not sent me an email telling me that if there's a genre you do not want to participate in, make sure you send me an email telling me what genre you do not want to do. Remember that my email address is peckhamj@marshall.edu. If you send it to peckham@marshall.edu, you'll be sending it to the other Dr. Peckham, my wife, Rachel, who you should get to know, but you don't want to get to know her by accidentally thinking you're talking to me. All right. I hope you're all doing well, that you're being careful and safe. Crazy times these days. So do your best to be, to take care of yourself and those you love. And hopefully we'll all get through this. All right. Thank you very much.